I feel like you've internalized the spirit and essence of Phantasm over the decades.
I mean, it's like the only movie that I can think of that has like accurately captured what it feels like to be dreaming.
There's a lot of dream logic. By that I mean, there is no logic to a lot of it, but it's like almost like Lynchian. The music's really interesting. It's probably like kind of indebted to like Tubular Bells from The Exorcist. It does something I've only seen done in The Long Goodbye, which is an Altman film, where the theme is kind of like reinterpreted. I think there's a point where the older brother is whistling it. I think it comes back in when they're in the bar slash lounge. You hear it in like a jazzy, upbeat kind of way.
I like how you said bar slash lounge because it just like it encapsulates the idea that like in the whole movie you never really know where you are. Phantasm is comparable to a fun house, and like some hallways lead to dead ends, and like there's trapdoors and like things around you don't make any sense.
You're in the morgue, but it feels almost like a museum. And there's a moment where like one of the several blonde girls in the movie, random blonde girls, they're interchangeable basically, but like she goes behind a almost like a trap door, like you said, and then she just vanishes.
And she's consumed in that like the bright holy light, and then
Right.
you never see her again, right?
Yeah, I don't think she comes back.
Was that the same girl who was like the fortune teller?
You got that slutty siren walking around seducing men, and then it turns out we're actually the tall man in drag.
I love how you just collectively refer to them as like the several blonde girls. Like it's like an ensemble in a play.
Yeah, exactly. The older brother looks like a Brady Bunch character.
Yeah, yeah.
The acting is really bizarre because I feel like all the actors, they deliver their lines like they're on ketamine.
Like especially Mike, the younger brother, like all of his dialogue, the way it's delivered, it almost sounds like he's a character in like the never-ending story. When he's pleading to his brother, it's like it reminds me of like when the horse was drowning. No, you must
Yeah.
not go out. You can't.
Like the whole theme when and the dialogue's bizarre, like with one of the blonde girls, her and her mom, I don't know if they're running like a scam or in touch with the supernatural. They make the box appear and she's like, "Don't fear, Michael, don't fear." It reminds me a lot of the scene in Fight Club, the whole part in Fight Club where he's like, "This is your hand, this is your pain, stay with it."
I love about the scene with the grandmother is you can tell based on the screenplay and the way the story is written, there were a lot of things that were probably cut out. Like there are,
Yeah.
just gaps, just even gaps in events that make no sense.
Yeah.
Like, I read a little about the production. Like the screenwriter did end up cutting a lot of it out. Out of all the things he cut out, he chose to keep that scene with the fortune teller in the movie.
Did some of the things they cut out like explain because I feel like there's moments like at the end the kid spends like 9 seconds in the dwarf realm, he gets yanked out with some kind of pre-cooked epiphany. He's like, slaves, they're using them for slaves and they have to crush them because of the gravity and the heat. But none of that was evident in what we saw. That was all just like ham-fisted exposition.
Yeah, one of like that line, that's exactly what I was talking about before. It's that like that weird, like bewildered, like, I'm a young boy on an adventure, that weird, like mystical tone.
It's pretty much about a boy who needs to come to terms with death. I think it's really emblematic in the scene where that really great scene with the where you first see the ball and he's approaching the tall man and they're both walking like they're in a mirror, like they're mirroring each other's movements. And then all of a sudden, it's the moment that he decides to flee that death is chasing him because he's fleeing from it.
That makes so much sense, and that's like so much more insight than I've ever really like given. It's almost like a bunch of people just like threw paint on a canvas, like
Yeah,
just this thing that made no sense.
yeah.
But I mean, somehow it ended up making sense at the end. Like somehow the movie works.
Somehow, and it's almost summarized in the scene where they're jamming, where they're just having like a random impromptu blues jam. It's like, why are they doing that? There's no reason, but it's just like, hey, look what I can do, and then the other guys like, look what and they just play for 2 minutes. That's kind of what the movie is. It's a stretched out jam
I
session.
really, really like that scene. Whenever I watch, whenever I'm gonna like watch a scene from the movie, which is more often than I'd like to admit, I look at that guitar scene because it's just, again, like out of all the things that were cut out, like, he looked at that at the very end and was like, I'm gonna keep this in the movie. Does that scene succeed in any way in developing the characters?
It does because at the end, the ice cream man, that whole denouement thing where like he's got his guitar and he brings it out and he kind of plays a little bit. Maybe that's like an example of a life and joy and creativity in the face of death and the tall man persevering. I think a friend or whatever visits the older brother and he's working on his car and he's like, "Oh, what brings you back?" And he goes, "Oh, your dead brother or whatever." And he goes, "Yeah." And then he goes, "And I heard about your folks. I'm really sorry." But he doesn't say anything about the dead brother. He just says he's sorry about the folks.
Yeah, like I feel so bad for like bursting into laughter when you said that. But
Yeah,
like you're right. Like, there's no clarification on like the timeline of the deaths. Like, did the parents
yeah.
die like literally like days before this
Days before,
happened?
yeah, yeah,
Within weeks?
yeah. Has
There's
it
no
been years?
clarification.
It doesn't make sense. And then there's a part where he goes, "Good thing you didn't let your brother come and see your dead brother like this." And he goes, "Yeah, because at mom and dad's funeral, he had nightmares for weeks." It's like, never mind the fact that his parents are dead. You think the funeral itself was the thing that gave him nightmares? And then there's a weird line like, it definitely isn't, it wouldn't fly today. But he hears like, the warbling and the rumbling, weird animal sounds from the dwarves. And he goes, "You sure it wasn't that retarded kid Tommy from up the street?"
My God, I completely forgot about that.
Yeah, yeah. How could you forget that? It's the greatest moment in the movie. Hey, what do you think about the rules of the movie? So yeah, I think it is kind of like a sci-fi movie, but the rules aren't, they're very vague, so it's hard to care about it.
It's like it's science fiction, but like the rules of it are so vague that it
Yeah,
becomes fantasy.
exactly. The log line would be, interdimensional, what is it? Grave robbers are crushing,
Well,
yeah,
the tall man is some kind of interdimensional evil being that, for some reason, is taking corpses in the real world, crushing the corpses down into dwarf proportions, however you want
yeah,
to say it, then reanimating them into slaves. They use that word in the movie.
yeah.
Um,
Although it's never evident, it's just, yeah, they're
yeah, well,
slaves.
like if he hadn't said that, I would have had no idea that that like surreal line of like dwarves snaking through that barren wasteland.
It's
I
just a
would have
cool
had no
shot, yeah.
idea what to make of that.
The dwarves themselves, do you think they're scary?
When I was younger, I was very, very scared of the dwarfs. And that's another statement that doesn't age well now. Exactly what I just said.
Because they're not
No,
dwarves.
I'm not frightened by the dwarfs.
Yeah.
I'm frightened by the process of becoming one of them.
So you're more scared of being converted into a dwarf than the dwarves themselves chasing after you like little minions. This could be the
Yeah.
darkest minion movie of the series. Yeah. But no, I love the shots of them like running towards charging the camera because you can just punt them like a football. And I love when the one dwarf like climbs over his shoulder like some like your little kid brother or whatever trying to choke you, and he's just like,
Yeah.
oh, and then he gets a gun and he like, which seems very unsafe. He just like shoots the back of his head, trying to get the dwarf.
Also, something that I want to talk about is the gratuitous use of weapons in this
Yeah,
movie. Well, I mean, the sequels, like I've only seen parts of the sequels to it, but I know the sequels are like there's weapons everywhere. Mike, the boy who's he's released from a psych ward or something as an adult
yeah.
by Reggie, and basically the tall man murders Reggie's entire family in like an explosion or something.
Jesus,
And then right after
seems
that,
harsh.
the very first thing they do is they go to an armory. And I just remember this long scene of them stocking up on weapons to fight the tall man.
The sequels of Phantasm took a very jingoistic turn. There's the whole moment in the first one where he's like, the brothers lecture the little brother about the guns. He's like, you never miss, and just macho. You always ate, some crap like that.
On that subject, it's a very masculine movie. It almost feels like it's in the mind of a boy who is like understanding death, but it's told from like a very male perspective.
Well, except the tall man in drag. Yeah, it's almost like a dual thing, like sex and death. Like he's understanding mortality and he's understanding sex because he's there's a lot of voyeurism in the movie. The minions are spying on the characters. The kid brother is spying on his older brother, and he's really creepy. He goes to the cemetery and he watches him banging that broad or whatever, and that's a really bizarre scene dialogue wise. All of a sudden, the kid runs through the thing screaming.
As he's running, I remember he feels the need to make this like long, continuous scream as he's running. It's not just like a
Yeah,
normal
yeah,
scream. It's like it
it's
stays at one. It's just
pitch.
like screeching. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then his exact words, he goes, "Wait, it's my brother. There's some kind of problem." Yeah, I like about the kind of there's death symbolism and when he's under the car. It's kind of a scene that doesn't really go anywhere, but I think the minions are screwing with him and they get him trapped under the car. And then but that whole shot, it reminds me of being like buried alive, of being in like a casket.
I mean, there's actually all this behind the scenes footage I saw where the actor who played Mike, I think he's talking about how he loved getting to crawl into the caskets and like, shutting the lid. Like he thought that was really cool. when
Yeah.
he's filming the
Oh wow, yeah. Typical adolescent, response. It's all really cool.
movie.
But one thing that didn't work for me was that little fly creature. If you ever had like a bee trapped in your room, you understand the horror of that scene. There's a scene where the he locks the kid brother in the room and he does it by jamming a screwdriver through the thing. I don't think there's
Yeah, yeah.
physics to that. And I've never tried it,
Like
but
and there's smoke too, right? Like smoke just like spews everywhere.
yeah, yeah, no. And then he rigs like his solution out of it. It's pretty much like a payoff without a setup. He devises an explosive device, and then he gets out that way through. I think he uses like gunpowder. I don't know what it's doing in his room, and then he blows up the fucking door. But it's never like in like a traditional movie, like a Hollywood or like a kids movie or whatever. You'd have the setup. Oh, this kid's into explosives, and then therefore he later on breaks out in the third act. That never happens. Don's just like, oh, I know how. He just blows up the goddamn door. I love there's a moment where he accidentally he's like wrestling with his brother down the stairs or whatever, and he kicks one of the railings out, which had to have been a mistake. But that little moment is a really cool like the jam scene. It's like one of those almost like accidental things that encapsulates the spirit of the movie.
Yeah, and like that's what I was kind of trying to hint at earlier. Like the movie doesn't feel like deliberate to me. It
Yeah,
feels like you said more like it's an accident. Something about it and like the tone and just the way it makes you feel. It's
yeah,
so like unique and like there's just something so like unsettling
yeah.
and eerie about the whole thing. I think that really is just what sells the whole movie.
Like what was the first scene that you ever saw this movie? I think it was the same one that I saw when we were kids with the VHS tape about the boogeyman and the different boogeymen in the horror movies, and then they had the tall man was one of them, and that whole scene, which is probably the best scene in the movie. Mike's wandering through the mortuary or the morgue, and then all of a sudden the ball comes after him. Or no, the first the guy tries to grab him, and then he bites him, and then the ball. It's almost like another death metaphor. It's like he's like being exhumed or whatever, cleared of blood, and it drains from him, and then he pisses himself, which is the nice little detail. And then it goes, and then the guy chases him, the tall man. He's like mirroring his movements. That's all surreal, very conscious tonal decisions that make it a really scary movie.
And one scene that I really like during that whole sequence is that part where, like, I think you described it when he sees the tall man, like, for the very first time
Yeah,
at the end of the hallway. And he's like, oh shit.
yeah. He just says, "Oh
Yeah.
shit."
I love the
Yeah,
moment where there's that weird, like, bang sound and he just
yeah,
takes off. And
yeah,
then the tall man, like, starts running right after him. Like,
yeah,
it's like this delayed reaction where, like, because the tall man, like, hesitates for a second and then he just like
yeah.
starts running. Like he's in no urgency to get to him because like he's going to get to him anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, he's almost like screwing around with him. So do you think the tall man's a scary character?
I do.
Yeah, me
Um,
too. Although it's also funny in parts.
yeah, and I think the actor played a big role in like really making that part come together
He
because
did.
I feel like if they had cast somebody who hadn't had such like a menacing presence, I don't think the movie would have had the effect that it does.
No, he almost seems like what part of the effectiveness of the character is that the actor, what was his name? Angus Scrim or something?
Angus Scrim, yeah, an awesome
Yeah.
name.
Amazing name. Sounds like a literary, burger or something. He like basically he seems genuinely like unhinged. Like he seems like an actual crazy person who wandered onto the set sometimes. Like that line delivery, funeral's about to begin, sir. Yeah, and there's a really funny shot. This is a good example of how it's simultaneously funny and scary. But when he's just walking down the street, but it's in slow motion, he's walking like a rag doll, like his limbs, long limbs are just flailing. And then he gets to the ice cream truck, and you just like almost like he's putting his hands over like a fire on a cold day, but he's like savoring the cold because I guess it represents death to him. But then
Yeah.
the moment where he looks at the kid and then sees him on the street is genuinely freaky.
Like there are some really cool like shots in this movie like from the point of view of just like a cinematography point of view.
Yeah,
um it's like the shot where the smoke is like drifting around him and like the way he turns kind of like in that like Nosferatu way where he
yeah,
like
yeah, like the
eyes like drift,
yeah,
yeah, like that. He
yeah.
just like turns slowly. I love all the shots when they're in that weird room with all the pods, where the doorway is. The way they shoot that room, it's like the
Really
way
is.
it makes
Yeah.
you feel when you look at it.
Right, and it's very with the scene at the end when they're going into the doorway into the dwarf dimension. Everything's like almost sci-fi lit. Everything's very bright, almost like a spaceship or something, or
Yeah, like there's a a point where it feels very like Star Wars for a moment. Like you're in
Yeah,
this
it
like
does. There's moments where both brothers at various points they turn their heads looking trying to follow the sound and they see the dwarfs like scuttle and scurry away. But it's very funny because even the older brother, when he sees the dwarfs, he sees them for a fraction of a second. It's cut very quick, but he doesn't seem too alarmed.
I really like how you describe the way the dwarves move because like they don't just run. They like the part when they're chasing him through the basement, they're like scampering along.
Oh, we got to mention the scene where the third random blonde girl who apparently he knows stops on the street, whatever, at night. Like Mike's like, you got to help me or whatever, and they bring him in the car, and then the fog appears, and then he hears the sounds, and then the lock starts to come undone, and he's like, oh shit, he's like, get out of here. It's a really funny scene. The dwarves come in, and they're not scary at all, but the women are screaming. They're like, ah! He fights the dwarves, and then he gets thrown out of the car, but we see the dwarves take the car away with the women in them and they've taken away screaming. It's ridiculous.
There's a pretty intense car chase in the movie. Like there's some pretty elaborate stunt driving. It looks expensive. Like they
Yeah.
felt the need to put in the midst of all of these other things going on, the science fiction and the fantasy, they felt the need to incorporate a car chase.
It's really a movie that's got everything for every kind of audience. It's got a jam session, it's got a car chase, it's got dwarfs being, crushing other corpses into dwarfs. All fun for the whole family. And then there's another funny scene. I can't remember the order of the scenes, but the older brother is walking down the street and then he sees the car approach and it's like ominous and creepy. You think it's one of the minions or something. And then I'm just gonna use minions because it's less, offensive than dwarfs. So then the car stops and it's very ominous, very long beat. And he's like got the gun pointed at it. He's like, who is it? Who's there, whatever. And then he finally creeps along and he opens the door and it turns out it's just Mike, his brother. And he's like, get in the car, we gotta go. Why did he wait that long? It doesn't make any sense.
There are other points too where like I said earlier, you can tell there are like gaps in events happening. Like
Yeah,
one scene that I love, and I think I've mentioned to you a few times, is the scene in the mortuary near the end where the characters have been separated for a while and they don't know what's going on. And suddenly
yeah,
Reggie, the ice cream man, he comes out of nowhere and he's like, they're like, oh wow, where were you? And he goes,
yeah,
oh well, I was in this other room with these other girls who were they were trapped, and I helped them
yeah.
out of the room, and then they're gone, and they're safe now, and then I came back here.
None of which we see. And is that like one of the deleted scenes, or is that just some bad writing?
I almost wish it were a deliberate choice
Yeah,
because again, like, I really like the fact that nothing makes any sense, but and
yeah.
somehow it does. Nothing makes sense, but everything does.